I'm going to mute everyone. You can unmute if you want to speak up, or you can ask questions afterward. Tonight's share is Le'ilu Nishmas Ariella Bas Avram. We will now begin. For our fourth share, our fourth class in the series on Choleh sheyesh bo Sakanah, on someone ill who's dangerously ill, who's in danger of his life, our subtopic tonight is danger addressed. What can you do? What can be done for such a person? We discussed in previous installments how to define danger in the halachic framework. We discussed both the actual clinical criteria that halacha recognizes as a danger to life. We discussed questions of authority, of whose opinions we follow, how to weigh conflicting assessments of danger. Tonight we're going to move on and discuss what can you actually do, assuming someone's life is in danger. What can you do for that person? So obviously, as we've been discussing from the very beginning of our series, you can do pretty much whatever you have to do to save the person's life. Anything, medicine, food, any kind of treatment, or any kind of life-saving activity, driving him to a hospital and so on, calling doctors, preparing medicine, surgical procedures, anything that's necessary to save the person's life, you can obviously do. The question is going to be, what about several questions, several interrelated questions. One group of questions we're going to discuss is, what if you have options of having a non-Jew do some of the malacha? Having a non-Jew drive the patient to the hospital, drive the ambulance, drive the Uber to the hospital, perform the procedure, make notes in his chart, and so on. What if you can have a non-Jew or minors, ketanim, do something? Is that better? Is that preferable? Is that not preferable? Should you do it yourself? Should you have a non-Jew do it? One question, one group of questions. Another question is shinui. There is a basic rule in the laws of Shabbos that when you do a Shabbos violation in an unusual way, there's a lot of discussion how to define unusual, but if you turn off a light with your elbow, with the back of your head, you flip a light switch with the back of your head, you're not allowed to do that, but it's not as egregious a sin as doing it directly with your hand in the normal way. That's called a shinui, a difference, an unusual, abnormal way of doing a malacha. The question is, should you do that? Should you try whatever violations of Shabbos, let's say, we do have to do for a person who's dangerously ill? Is it preferable to try to minimize the severity of infraction by doing with the shinui? Third question, third group of questions. If we can avoid being Mechal Shabbos at all, we can wait till after Shabbos, for example. It's an hour before Shabbos. The patient really needs a certain injection or certain treatment, which involves a violation of Shabbos. Maybe we can wait an hour. So is it preferable to wait an hour till it's not Shabbos anymore? Or assuming that a treatment that if we do it right now will entail malacha, we don't have the right tools. So if we do it right now, we'll have to do it in a way that involves a Shabbos violation. If we wait for an hour, we'll have other tools, other options. We won't have to do Mechal Shabbos. Should you wait in order to avoid having to violate the Shabbos? Now, again, obviously, in all these cases, having a non-Jew instead of a Jew, or waiting, or shinoi, obviously, if that will increase the risk to the patient of dying, obviously, there's no question. Even as we've said repeatedly, even if it's only a suffix, a question of doubt, or even if it's a small possibility of danger to the life, obviously you have to do what you have to do. But all these cases, assuming that in our best assessment, the patient's chances of survival will not be affected by waiting, by having a non-Jew do the procedure, by doing a shinoi, assuming that as far as we can tell, as far as we can assess the situation, there is no risk to the patient, is it preferable to use a non-Jew? Is it preferable to wait? Is it preferable to use a shinoi? Another group of questions we're going to discuss, a somewhat different angle that in today's share, is what are you actually allowed to do? So anything that involves saving his life, you can do. What about just providing him other comforts or other treatments, which you don't anticipate are going to save his life? He has cancer. He has a heart condition. But you want to treat his eczema. He also happens to have eczema. So so while he's hospitalized in an ICU, For cancer, for a heart condition, you want to go treat his eczema. You want to go. He has a cut on his finger. You want to you want to treat the cut in a way that involves a violation of Shabbos. Can you do that, or can you only actually treat the things that only treat the actual life-threatening condition? Finally, a last question I hope to touch on is, let's say, related to the previous question. Let's say we have things that the sick person wants. We don't believe that they will in any way physically, objectively affect his medical condition. And even, and it's not even a medical issue at all, just something he wants. The person is agitated. He wants to see his wife. He wants to see his father. Seeing his wife or father objectively isn't going to help the patient. But his mental state, science has come to realize relatively recently that the mind-body connection, that psychological health is closely connected to physical health. If the person doesn't get what he wants, if we don't grant his wishes, we tell him it's not a legitimate medical issue, and we're not going to do it for you, he may become quite agitated, and that itself may have a negative impact on his physical health. Is that a reason to Mechal Shabbos? He says, I really want to see my father. I must talk to my father. Can we drive his father? Can we put his father in a car and have him drive to the hospital so we can talk to his father? So these are the questions we're going to discuss. Basically, two families of questions. The first group of questions is, variations of the question, do we try to limit the violation of Shabbos or any other potential prohibition involved? We're going to focus on Shabbos. Do we try to limit the violation of Shabbos by having non-Jews or minors do it, or using a shinui, or doing it in an abnormal way, or waiting to see if we can avoid the Chil Shabbos? And the second group of question is, assuming we aren't directly treating his medical condition, can we do other things for his comfort, or can we do other things to avoid agitation, which we worry can affect his physical health as well? So we'll begin with the first group of questions, and in particular, the question of doing malacha via non-Jews. So the central text there is a passage in the Talmud Bavli in Yoma. It talks about a sick person. We heat up water, and we do various kinds of work for him. And then the Gemara says, we don't einos in dvarim halalu. We don't do these things lo al yidei goyim, lo al yidei kusiyim. We don't do it via non-Jews. Ela al yidei gedolei Yisrael. Rather, we use Gedolei Yisrael. What does Gedolei Yisrael mean? Gadol in Hebrew means large or great. What does Gedolei Yisrael mean? So there are two interpretations. The Rambam in the commentary to the Mishnah and the Taz on Shulchan Aruch says Gedolei Yisrael means, as we use the term in modern Hebrew and in modern Jewish language, Jewish vernacular, Gedolei Yisrael means great ones of Israel, men who are great in wisdom, great in piety. Great men. That's what Gedolei Yisrael means. Why great men? We'll discuss that later. But Gedolei Yisrael means not just we don't use non-Jews. We even ideally, we don't say Chil Shabbos is okay. We have to do it. We'll hold our nose and do it. Let's find someone who isn't very pious to do it. On the contrary, Gedolei Yisrael. We find the greatest men, great men of Israel. They're the ones who do the Chil Shabbos. Others learn the Rambam in his Mishnah Torah, as opposed to the commentary to the Mishnah in his main halachic work, as understood by Rabbi Yosef Karo. In the Beis Yosef and Kesef Mishnah, they understand that the Rabbi Yosef Karo in particular understands Gedolei Yisrael does not mean what the phrase usually means. Yisrael simply means a Jew as opposed to Goyim, as opposed to non-Jews. Gedolim simply means adults as opposed to minors. Some say the grammar is not correct. It should have said Yisraelim Gedolim if that's the case. But these are the two interpretations of Gedolei Yisrael, either great men of Israel or adult Jews as opposed to Gentiles or non-Jews, as opposed to Gentiles or minors. So the question obviously is, why? Why don't we use non-Jews? The Talmud is utterly silent on this point. We don't use non-Jews. Does not explain why. Moreover, there is a major dispute among the medieval commentaries about what the actual text of the Talmud is. We're not going to get into all the fine points of exactly how to read the Gemara, but we'll take the broader picture here. There are 3 or 4 explanations given in the Rishonim and Achronim for why we use Jews and adult Jews and not goyim, not minors. Why? So first of all, it's possible to read the Gemara. You don't have to use goyim or minors. You could, but you don't have to. That's what the Gemara is saying. But all or almost all the poskim understand it doesn't just mean we don't have to use non-Jews. It means we should not use non-Jews. We should be particular and use specifically Jews and Gedolei Yisrael even maybe. But we should dafka not use non-Jews. Why not? Tosfos says, Tosfos' commentary to the Gemara, on the Gemara, he says, even if it's possible to use a non-Jew, there's no risk to the patient, mitzvah be Yisrael, nevertheless, it's preferable to use a Jew. Shema yis'atel hanakri v'lo yasev yavli de Sakanah. A non-Jew cannot be trusted to act with as much alacrity as we would desire. It's not his fellow Jew. He doesn't have the same fundamental value of human life. Whatever it is, we don't trust a non-Jew to act with as much alacrity as the halacha calls for. Therefore, we dafka should not use a non-Jew because we don't trust he will do a good enough job. Another reason given in the Rush, explained by the Beis Yosef, another reason that some suggest is that if we make a point of looking for a non-Jew, if we go around saying, look, Shabbos violation is a serious business, let's try to avoid it, let's try to find a non-Jew. So even if that makes sense in principle, people are going to come away saying, okay, it's really somewhat dubious to violate Shabbos, even for Pikuach Nefesh. They're looking for non-Jews. So the next time, if there are no non-Jews, people will say, I don't know, last time they wanted a non-Jew. Maybe it's not really such a good idea to have a Jew do it. They won't understand that, of course, we use a Jew if necessary. It's just that using a non-Jew is an option. We try to use a non-Jew. People won't understand the halacha properly. And if we look for a non-Jew or a woman or a minor or different types of people to do it today, then that will, in the future, that will cause people to think that the Chil Shabbos is not such a clear-cut basis for violating Shabbos by an adult Jew, and that can lead to danger to people if they won't want to be Machal Shabbos. That is the second reason given for the halacha that we don't use we dafka don't use a non-Jew. There's a third reason that appears in the Rambam and the Mishnah Torah. The Rambam says we don't use goyim, ketanim, avadim, nashim. We don't use non-Jews, minors, slaves, women. Why? This is almost the opposite of the previous pshat. The previous explanation was that if we look for a non-Jew, people will say, I guess Shabbos is really serious, and it's not such a simple matter to override Shabbos to save lives. The Rambam says the opposite problem. People will think Shabbos is not so serious. If people who are not Talmidei Chachamim may say, oh, that they're telling me to do it. I guess Shabbos is not really so important after all. They won't understand that it's only because of Pikuach Nefesh, and that's one of the very few justifications for overriding Shabbos. They'll just say, oh, I guess Shabbos is not really so important. When there's a rabbinic will, there's a halachic way. When they really want to, they just overlook Shabbos. So so ideally we don't want to give this business over to people who are afraid won't properly distinguish. The Kesef Mishnah says that only applies to women and children because they're people who are supposed to keep Shabbos, and if they decide that Shabbos is not so important, that's a big problem. It doesn't apply to non-Jews. We don't care if they think Shabbos is important or not. But be that as it may, this is a third reason given for the basic idea of the Gemara that we ideally lechatchila want a Jew to do it and not a non-Jew or not a woman, because we want to make sure that people don't come to the wrong conclusions and be overly lenient with respect to Shabbos. But the bottom line is that whatever the reason is, as I said, all or virtually all poskim agree that not just we don't have to use a non-Jew, the halacha is we dafka do not use a non-Jew. It seems that we dafka don't use a woman, we dafka don't use a non-Jew, we dafka don't use a minor, we look for Gedolei Yisrael. Another point made, the Taz brings, some of the poskim say, why Gedolei Yisrael? Some say we want to teach everyone a lesson. We want to say, look, everyone must understand that Shabbos is 100% absolutely permitted, overridden for Pikuach Nefesh, to save lives. Gedolei Yisrael, teachable moment. We want the greatest, most impressive men we have to make a public demonstration of the halacha. So we look for Gedolei Yisrael. And this is the halacha. This is brought in Shulchan Aruch. That we don't look for non-Jews. Kishmachal and Shabbos for Choleh sheyesh bar Sakanah. Mishtadlin, we make an effort not to use non-Jews or ketanim or minors or women. Ela yidei Yisraelim gedolim ubnei das, Shulchan Aruch's formulation, not gedolei Yisrael in the sense of great men, but Yisrael gedolim, adult Jews, bnei das. That's the shita that is accepted by all the poskim. What is not accepted by all the poskim, what is a matter of considerable dispute, and a point that it will have major ramifications for the application of this halacha in a practical and contemporary. Long I was out, I noticed my connection went down. I have tried to I've tried to restart it.
I think you just read the Mechaber before you cut out.
Okay, good, thank you. So the Mechaber says that brings us halacha that we dafka don't use goyim, we don't use ketanim, we don't use women, and that's the halacha psuka. That is the halacha accepted by all authorities, that we dafka use Yisraelim, adult Jews, males, and we don't use non-Jews in particular. That's not debated. What is debated, though, is a point that is a major controversy and has major ramifications for the practical application of this halacha, is the position of the Riyaz. The Riyaz, a late medieval authority. The Shiltei Giborim brings the Riyaz, who says as follows. He explains the Gemara. He says, we don't look for non-Jews. He says, why not? He says, because by looking for them, there may be some delay and the patient will be in danger. Meaning, we saw Tosfos, who says that they won't do it with so much alacrity. The Riyaz says something similar. He says, by looking for non-Jews, that may cause delay. Obviously, everyone's going to agree that if you know it's going to take more time, if you know that they're 10 minutes away, and that the Hatzalah ambulance is right here, and the regular EMTs are 10 minutes out, there's no question. Nobody's going to disagree with that. That's not a chiddush. But the Riyaz seems to be saying, the Gemara means, even if you think that you can get somebody quickly, if you start looking for a non-Jew, the very fact that we're adding restrictions and hurdles, even if you hope you can do it quickly, it may cause some delay. So the halacha is, don't do that. Don't add any extra requirements that may cause delay. Says the Riyaz, but if there are non-Jews or minors, ketanim, right here, then do them. And you should not use Gedolei Yisrael. Because since it's possible to do it beheter, it's possible to do it without Shabbos violation by having a non-Jew do it, ein lanu lasos be'isur. The Riyaz says, ideally, we still do try to avoid Chil Shabbos where possible. So if a non-Jew is available, you should use him. The Aruch HaShulchan says he doesn't understand the Riyaz. The Gemara says you don't use a non-Jew. How can you disagree with the Gemara? But the pshat of the Riyaz seems to be relatively straightforward. He seems to be saying that the Gemara only means you don't start looking for a non-Jew, but if a non-Jew is right here and there's no reason not to use him, then you do, because why not do it in a way of heter? Why do it in a way of isur? Why do it in a way that violates Shabbos if you can do it in a way that doesn't violate Shabbos? So the Riyaz says that if the non-Jew is right here and there's no delay at all, there's nothing to talk about. Apparently he's not concerned for Tosfos as far that the non-Jew will do it with a lack of alacrity. The non-Jew is right here. You can monitor him. Everything's under control. Then you use the non-Jew. How do we paskin? So it's a big machlokas among the achronim. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't mention this Riyaz. The Shulchan Aruch seems to say that no matter what, you just don't use a non-Jew. He brings the Gemara Kipshuto without any qualifications. The Ramah says, Yesh Omrim, some say that if you can do it by a guy without any delay, you do it, but you do it with a guy, the Chayin Nagim, and that's the custom. However, of course, if there's a concern that Yisatel Hakim, if there's a concern that there'll be delay, then of course you don't use a non-Jew. But the Ramah says the minhag is that you use a guy if you can without any delay. The Taz is very, very unhappy with the Ramah. The Taz is not like this at all. The Taz says absolutely not. He thinks the Ramah is completely wrong. It's Tema. And the Taz has a long discussion, but he basically has two reasons why he thinks this is not correct. two reasons why he thinks you should not use a guy, even if he's right here and there's no delay in getting him. First of all, he says we have that concern that that the Gemara says people will start thinking that you're supposed to find a guy, and next time when there's no guy, people are going to start hesitating before a Jew does it. We can't allow these types of errors and mistakes to occur. So the Taz says that's how some Rishonim explain the Gemara. It doesn't make sense to say let's use a guy even opportunistically when he's right here. Once we start doing that, people will get into their heads that we have to have a guy, and who knows what will happen the next time, and people's lives will be endangered. That is the first argument of the Taz. The second point to the Taz, and it's important to keep in mind these 2 points. The second point to the Taz is that the halacha is zrizus, alacrity. We have to go as fast as we can. Every minute counts, like Hatzalah says. Every second counts. Every minute counts. Even if the non-Jew is right here, and we can see what he's doing. But a Yisrael, a Jew, we have a presumption a Jew will be even more careful and more diligent in saving a fellow Jew's life. Yasena tfei bezrizus. And therefore, for these 2 reasons, first of all, it can set a bad precedent. Next time, somebody might avoid being Mechal Shabbos if he can't find a guy. Second, we have a presumption that a Jew will do it with more zrizus. Because of these 2 reasons, the Taz says the Ramah is wrong, the Riyaz is wrong. Even if there is a guy right here, we do not use the guy. We do not use the guy. We have a Jew do it. Many Achronim are at least sympathetic, if not outright siding with the Taz, El Yerabah. And the reason they bring is because the Yisrael will do it more bezrizus. They focus on that second reason of the Taz, the El Yerabah, the Tosefah Shabbos, the Mishnah Berurah. This is me again calling on my wife's phone. Can you hear me here?
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So thanks. Sorry, I'm not sure. Having technical difficulties in my system. I was using a new webcam, and that may have interfered somehow with other things. But here we are. Okay. So where was I? Where was
Grossman,
I?
can I ask a question?
Yes.
So the opinion that says that you can't ask a non-Jew to help with the emergency. So like I'd imagine, is that opinion saying that, let's just say you're in an area where you don't know if there are Jews, right? Does that opinion say you have to go out of your way to look for Jews? Or like, is there some framework that what that opinion gives? Because I imagine Pikuach Nefesh, in a rural area or somewhat, you would have to use whatever you could find.
Yeah. So everyone's going to agree both ways. Everyone's going to agree that if looking for a non-Jew takes more time, you should not look for a non-Jew, and vice versa as well. I'm pretty sure everyone would agree that if looking for a Jew is going to take more time, you don't do that either. I think everyone agrees that if there's a clear reason to believe that the patient's interest will be better served, faster, treatment will come better and faster one way or another, I think there's no question you would use whichever one you have. The debate is only if as far as we can tell, it's neutral and both are available. Is it better to use a Jew or better to use a non-Jew? But I think there's no question if the EMT gets there 10 minutes before Hatzalah, you go with the EMT. Unless you really believe that the care will be bad, you have reason to believe that they're lackadaisical about the care. I think it's more of, in that case, I think it's more a question of your factual assessment. But our discussion is really focused on cases where, as far as you can tell, but both options are immediate, or both options take the same amount of time, and it's just a question of which to prefer if you have the luxury of choice. So many Achronim agree with this idea of the Taz, that if they agree with this idea of the Taz, that lechatchila one should not use a non-Jew, one should use a Jew. However, despite that, many Achronim also say, as a practical matter, that many contemporary poskim say that once again, this debate is only where there's reason to believe. Again, they focus on the second reason of the Taz, that we think a Jew will be faster, better, more diligent about it. But in a case where what you're doing is routine, there's no time pressure, it's scheduled in advance, and there's no reason to believe that a Jew or a non-Jew, anybody will be particularly faster, then there is no reason to then there's no reason to dafka use a Jew. And on the contrary, well, one should use a non-Jew. This is a common situation in hospitals. There are routine things. You have to give an injection, run some scan, plug something in. There are routine scheduled things that there's no pressure, there's no urgency. I mean, it's important, but it's something that was known in advance and planned and scheduled in advance. There's no question of someone's going to do it carelessly or going to delay and procrastinate. In these types of cases, many contemporary posts can say that we should indeed prefer to use a non-Jew, again, when available, without any delay. Rabbi Nissen Karelitz in Chutshani, for example, says that even according to the Taz, he says something where it's dachuf, where it's urgent, it's an emergency, he says, but something that was yadua merosh, that we knew in advance he needed a certain treatment every day, he needs an injection, he needs, you have to connect him to some machine every day at a certain time. In that case, he says, even l'chatchila, you can use a guy because there's no, you should have a Jew supervised, but you can use a guy because there's no real concern that something's going to go wrong or it's not going to happen or it's going to be delayed critically and there'll be any real danger. He says, generally speaking, a hospital, meaning a Jewish hospital, in Israel, should have a Shabbos guy, even for Choleh sheyesh Sakanah, who can do things that, again, that the man is not bahul, it's not urgent, it's not bring equipment, do things that the texts do, that are not skilled work, that it's an emergency, that has to be done right away. But he says routine things, that there's no danger of delay and of doing a sloppy job. You just need something done, something basic and routine and scheduled done. There's no filling in the charts, writing things down. You can review what he writes. He says these types of things, everybody would agree that it is better if possible, not if it's going to delay, not if there's going to be any cause for concern. But if there's no delay, he says certainly we should use a non-Jew. Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa as well. He says that things that are not nechutza are not urgent, and there's a non-Jew around. If you can, it's better to have a non-Jew. Moshe Feinstein has a couple of tshuvas on the topic about Hatzalah. One in Tafshin Lamed Ches in 78, and one in Tafshin Mem Beit. Follow-up tshuva in 1982. Both to Rabbi Mordechai Tendler, his grandson. The basic question he's discussing is, should Hatzalah use a non-Jew to drive the ambulance? Should, if they're going someplace on Shabbos, should Hatzalah use a non-Jew to do the actual ambulance driving? So in the two tshuvas, he adopts somewhat different positions. He revised his view. In the first tshuva, in Tafshin Lamed Ches, he says, if there are non-Jews around, and we trust the non-Jew, he's not going to, do any criminal things. Then he said it's better to take, again, assuming there's no delay, it's not at night, we have the non-Jew is readily available, there's no delay to get him. It is better, ideally, one should have a non-Jew drive the ambulance. He says, even though the Gemara says we don't use non-Jews, and if the non-Jew is available, you use them. And even though that's the Ramashit, even though the Taz says that we don't do that, the Taz says always use a Jew no matter what. Says Ramosha, again, that's either because he won't have so much rezus, he won't do it so diligently, or the next time they'll think you have to dafka use a Jew and they won't do it at all if they can't find a non-Jew. But driving an ambulance, he says, is Ramosha assumes that the non-Jew is not going to drive the ambulance in an any less zealous way than the Jew. He doesn't assume that the Jew will go twice as fast or cut around the corners faster. He assumes that the non-Jew, that everyone drives the same way, he says. Therefore, he says, I'm not sure why he's not worried about the other thing, about Machshila and Lasid Lavo, that next time if they can't find a non-Jew, they won't do it. But he says that there's no issue of delay here. Similar to Rav Karela, Terry says there's no reason not to use a non-Jew if he's available. So in his first tshuva in 78, he said, assuming there's no delay. Again, if there is delay, then of course you don't wait even a moment. If the non-Jew is out in his smoking break, you're not going to wait for him to come back. But assuming they're both right here, he says that you should ideally use a non-Jew when available. However, he changed his mind. In the later tshuva, 4 years later, he quotes his earlier tshuva, but he says he changed his mind for various reasons. And his first reason is very strange. He says that he found out, they told him, it's really not a good idea to have a non-Jew, because Hatzalah has to do things that are against the law, that the law wouldn't allow to save the patient. And they can't do it if the non-Jew's around, because he might report them and have to pay him off and he can blackmail them. So they need the freedom to operate without, I don't know what that's all about, but that's one thing he says. But beyond that, he says, he says we do have this idea that we're concerned. We don't want to set a precedent that we need to have specifically non-Jews. The Machshila and Lasid Lavo, there's a concern that if we start looking for a non-Jew, people will say that we need to have non-Jews. We don't do that. And even though the Ramah says that if the non-Jew is right here, we're not concerned for that, the Taz disagrees. The Hanachon Ladina Ka'ataz, Ramosha sides with the later acronym like the Taz. We do not look for non-Jews even when they're right here. The Shulchan is correct, he says. And Ramosha here sides, the first tshuva, he kind of didn't take a position. He just said here, even the Taz agrees. But in the second tshuva, he sides with the Taz, and he says that for various reasons, Hatzalah does not use a non-Jew. Hatzalah should not use a non-Jew to drive the ambulance. So in general, the bottom line is that we really have three categories. In a case where there's clearly going to be a delay by using one or the other, of course, you use whoever's faster. If the non-Jew is going to be a delay, you use a Jew. If the Jew is going to be a delay, like Adam's point, then you use a non-Jew. If there's clearly going to be one is faster than the other and time is of the essence, then of course you do whatever's faster. In a case where there's clearly no issue, it's a routine and scheduled in advance and it's not a question of urgency and of rush. Then many contemporary poskim say that there's no reason to use a Jew. If you can use a non-Jew, he's readily available, and it's not something we're concerned he won't do properly and he won't do with as much diligence. And you do use a non-Jew, and the machlokas really is in between. In cases where it is a sudden thing and there is some amount of skill maybe and reliance upon the person's diligence, then we have a machlokas. If on paper they're both going to do the same job, some poskim the Ramah says, and yes, in that case, you should use the non-Jew if he's available. Other poskim say, no, we don't really trust him that he'll do as good a job as a Jew, and therefore you should prefer the Jew. But again, many poskim, Rav Karelitz or Moshe or Shlomo Zalman, in various cases, take the kind of the common sense view that it really depends on your best estimate of whether there's going to be any likelihood of one doing a better job or another. Many poskim seem to agree, if there's really no reason to believe that it matters, then we fall back on the basic rule that all else being equal, why not use a non-Jew to avoid Chil Shabbos by the Jew? This idea that it's, even though Shabbos is 100% mutter, you don't have to have any qualms, any charata, you did a great mitzvah in violating Shabbos. Nevertheless, if you have a choice, it's better not to. This point appears in several other contexts in our general discussion as well. I'll just mention briefly this idea that a person does nothing wrong by being Mechal Shabbos or any other aveira to save his life is a subject of a very interesting tshuva of Rabbi Yaakov Eschlinger, the Binyan Tzion. He was asked about by a student or a colleague, a Talmud Chacham, who was sick on Yom Kippur, and the doctors told him he had to eat, so he ate, and he felt terrible about it afterward. He felt so consumed with guilt. Hashem is rejecting his Yom Kippur service. How can he atone for what he did? What can he do to get back in God's good graces? The Rav Eschlinger said, you're absolutely wrong. There is no reason to feel bad. You did absolutely the right thing. You should have no qualms, no regret. You didn't do anything wrong. We didn't give you some kind of dispensation. You did absolutely the right thing. It was a mitzvah, and you shouldn't feel bad in any way. That's no question that's true. A person who's Mechal Shabbos for Pikuach Nefesh, it's absolutely true. Nevertheless, many poskim use this language that if you could do it beheter, if you could do it in a way where there's absolutely zero risk to the patient, do it beheter without necessary, you should do it that way. L'chatchila. Even the Taz and even those who are stringent by not using non-Jews, that's because of a concern for the precedent, because there's a concern for delay or for setting the wrong example. But in a case where there's really, really no concern and there's no not to delay, the general consensus of poskim is, in other contexts as well, that you should delay. Another example is Shinui. The same Ramah who says that you ideally use a non-Jew when available, the Ramah says that if you have a Shinui, if you can do it without Chil Shabbos Daraisa, without black letter bona fide Chil Shabbos, you can do it in an abnormal way, which reduces the severity of the prohibition. It's better to do it like that. I didn't see much in the way of debate about that. That seems to be much more accepted than the idea that we use a non-Jew. The Ramban, going all the way back to Ramban.
Rabbi Grossman, just on that point, but interestingly, the Mechaber of the Shulchan Aruch does not say that in terms of a Shinoi.
Yes, that is true. The Shulchan Aruch does not bring this. The Shulchan Aruch does not bring this idea that you should do with the Shinoi. And I would have liked to do more research in finding whether anybody actually Anybody actually Lamaisa disagrees? Yes, it's true. It is the Ramah. The Ramah added it to the Mechaber, and the Stimas Halashu Mechaber might not be mashma like that, but might not be so mashma like that. Yeah, so that's a point maybe that requires a little further that requires some more research, whether people disagree with that as well. But just to quote a few more poskim on that general point, going back to the Rishon, the Ramban. The Ramban writes that in Torah Sa'adam, the Ramban writes that if we know and recognize the illness in question, that it can delay, we don't need to do Chil Shabbos, we can wait till after Shabbos, we can wait for the treatment and avoid Chil Shabbos, Vadai Aser Lasislo, then there is no question that we is prohibited to Mechal Shabbos if it can wait, if there's no harm in waiting. This point is elaborated on a similar point by the Rashba as well. Tshuva and the Rashba that seems to be widely accepted in the poskim. The Rashba is a very interesting tshuva. He was asked about a certain medical treatment that doctors were prescribing in his time, Jewish doctors, which involved vinegar that was sourced from non-Jews. Vinegar that's sourced from non-Jews poses a serious kashrus problem, wine vinegar, because wine is yayin, wine is tam yainam, and it's prohibited for a Jew to drink non-Jewish wine, and vinegar retains the same prohibition. So the Rashba was outraged. He was absolutely floored that anyone would allow this. He felt this was absolutely treif, this medicine, and there was no justification for it. In the tshuva, he discusses a variety of possible heterim, one of which is pikuach nefesh, that they were prescribing this for people who were seriously ill, and the Rashba rejects that. He says it was a type of fever apparently that we're talking about, kadachas. The Rashba discusses whether kadachas should be treated as Choleh sheyesh bo Sakanah at all. And even if it is, he says, it's still not a justification for taking treif medicine. He says non-kosher medicine. He says, even though it's true that all prohibitions, including stam yenam, would be permitted for a Choleh sheyesh bo Sakanah, but he says, surely you can't think that means even if there's a kosher alternative. Are you really going to tell me, he says, that if a person has a kosher and non-kosher option, he can just say Choleh sheyesh bo Sakanah, I'll eat the non-kosher option? Of course not, he says. He says this patient doesn't have to take this preparation right now. He has some window of time where he can he has some window of time that he can wait before taking this the medicine. He says by that time we can get kosher medicine. Apparently, we can get kosher medicine. He says chas v'shalom, there's no heter to take the treif medicine. This is very similar to the Ramban. There is even if right now this is the only medicine that's available and it's a Choleh sheyesh bo Sakanah, it doesn't matter. If you can wait a little bit, and we don't believe that the waiting, again, some conditions you can't wait for. A person's having a heart attack, you don't say wait 10 minutes and we'll see what we can do. It doesn't work like that. A person's having a stroke, we don't say wait a half hour and we'll see what we can do for you. So obviously it depends on the case. But whatever this type of fever, again, some fevers you can't wait. Some fevers are, the body's going into some kind of shock and you can't wait. But obviously it depends on the facts. But in theory, the holding of the Ramban and the Rashba is that if there is something you can wait for, and by waiting you can avoid doing the avera, you can avoid Chil Shabbos, you can avoid eating non-kosher because kosher will become available. If by waiting at least a small amount of time you can avoid the Isser, then of course it's better to avoid the Isser, because even though doing the Isser, Chil Shabbos or non-kosher is 100% justified, at the end of the day, if you can avoid it, you should. And therefore the holding of the poskim is that one should wait, similar to what we discussed about non-Jews and Shinui, that if there's really no downside, ideally a person should wait, and that's what he should do. Shulchan Aruch Harav directly contrasts these two dinim. He says, on the one hand, we have the Ramban, we have this idea that if a person could wait, he should. On the other hand, he says you don't do it by a non-Jew if a Jew is available. What's the difference? He has a subtle legalistic difference. He says, if the malacha has to be done with Chil Shabbos, then it's mutter for a Jew. You don't need a non-Jew. Or if you don't have to do Chil Shabbos at all, then it's better not to do it. Whatever the difference is, the bottom line is that the basic idea is that if it's a question of Jew or non-Jew, that is a major machlokes poskim, as we discussed earlier, either because we're worried the non-Jew won't do it with as much alacrity, or because it'll set the wrong precedent, or for other reasons. But a non-Jew versus Jew is a major discussion. When it comes to these other cases, when it comes to Shinoi, when it comes to waiting a little bit to see if you can avoid the need to do the Avera, again, a little bit, not a long time. Chaburah's language is the the Mishabura commenting on that din, that if you do it without a shinui, you do it without a shinui, he says, because the general principle is that as long as you can do it beheter, do it beheter and don't do it behisser. And Huadin, he says, even if there will be a delay, brings the earlier postman, there will be a delay, ma'at, a small delay, but it's not urgent. The Choleh is not bohol, it's not a heart attack, it's not a stroke, it's not bohol, it's not time is of the essence. You wait a little bit, he says, because it's better to avoid doing Chol Shabbos Daraisa if you can. If you can, he says again. If you're not sure if it'll, elsewhere he says, if you're not sure if it'll cause any possible danger for the patient, of course you have to do Machal Shabbos right away. But if you're sure that there's no downside in waiting, then he says we will. Then he says we absolutely will wait to avoid the Chol Shabbos. Discussing at least briefly the other questions I mentioned. What about treating the patient? He's a Choleh sheyesh ba Sakanah. What about treating him for something that is not actually the Sakanah? It's not going to make or break it for his life-threatening condition. It's some other medical treatment that we would normally provide if it didn't involve Chol Shabbos, but it does not involve saving his life. So the Magen Mishnah has one line, or a few lines, but one key line, which sparked a huge discussion in later poskim. The Magen Mishnah says, mashma, that the mashmos of the halacha is that once he reaches the level of Choleh sheyesh ba Sakanah, l'chol tzrachav machal, and we do anything he needs, any medical need he has, we're machal Shabbos for, even if withholding a particular treatment will not cause sakana, doesn't matter, we do it anyway. And the Shulchan Aruch is not explicit on this point, but that's how the Achronim understand the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch writes that we do for a Choleh sheyesh ba Sakana kol sherigilim lasas lo b'chol, anything that we would normally do for him during the week. That again, unless you can wait, then you wait. But without the question of waiting, anything that we would do for him the week we do on Shabbos, Magen Avraham and the later post can say that means, like the Magen Mishnah, that even if it's something that won't make or break his condition, that won't endanger him, once he's a Choleh sheyesh ba Sakana, we treat whatever we need to. We don't just limit our treatment to saving his life. We provide any kind of treatment that we would normally provide for this person during the week. Not all poskim agree. The Mishnah Berurah, the Biur Halacha go on at length that many poskim disagree, he says. Many poskim disagree with this, he says. And therefore, as a compromise, as a pshara between these shitas, he says, in this case at least, we would certainly try, if we had a non-Jew available, we would certainly, again, whether to use a non-Jew to actually save his life. Now, we saw that Taz and many poskim say, no, if it's actually a critical, urgent, life-saving treatment, you don't use a non-Jew, even if he's available. But when it comes to this question of non-life-saving treatment, you want to treat his eczema, you want to put a Band-Aid on a cut that he has, then the Magen Mishnah, the Magen Avraham seem to say, and they understand the Shulchan Aruch to be saying that even that you can Machal Shabbos with the Chol Shabbos Daraisa for that. Mishnah Berurah says many poskim disagree, and he recommends for that at least you should use a non-Jew. What is the rationale for this shita, though, that the Magen Mishnah shita, that once he's a Choleh sheyesh ba Sakana, you can be Machal Shabbos even when his life is not in danger. So even when this does not involve saving his life. So there are different suggestions in the poskim. Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach apparently is quoted as having suggested that people will make errors of judgment. It's a slippery slope. Even if you think this particular treatment is not going to save his life, once we ask the medical professionals to start weighing and judging, can I do this? Can I do that? This is just a scratch. I shouldn't do this. Once they start going down that road, he says, eventually someone's going to come down on the wrong side of a question and say, this is not really crucial. You're going to miss something. That's pikuach nefesh. So as to avoid the slippery slope, he says, the halacha just decided, and again, pikuach nefesh is so serious that even if it's just something at the far end of a slippery slope, we're concerned about that as well. So to avoid that, the halacha establishes as an absolute rule, no questions asked. Once he's a Choleh sheyesh ba Sakana, we stop asking questions and we provide any treatment that we would do during the week. Rav Asher Weiss says something similar. He has a lengthy discussion to this point. Rav Asher Weiss says something similar. He says that the reason is, he says, because Chazal have a presumption. There's a kind of medical/legal presumption that we don't really know for sure. Anything that involves his general well-being could be pikuach nefesh. And Rav Asher doesn't explain it so clearly medically, but Rav Asher says the halacha operates on a general presumption that any medical treatment could ultimately be connected to pikuach nefesh. And as an analogy, as a bridge to our final topic of the night, he says it's like the Gemara says about a yoledes, a woman who gave birth, that were mechal Shabbos even for her peace of mind. What is that all about? So the Gemara says something quite fascinating. The Gemara says that a yoledes. The Gemara says that just to go back for one moment to talking about yoledes, I mentioned earlier that the Ramah brings a shita that for that if you can use a shinui without any delay, if you can do the Shabbos violation in an unusual way, you should. That is based on a Gemara about yoledes. The Gemara says about a yoledes, about a woman who gives birth, that you should do at least certain malachas, maybe all malachas. You should do them with a shinui if possible. The Ramah understood that applies to any case of Choleh sheyesh bo Sakanah, that any time you can use a shinui, you should. It's based on that Gemara that says, at least when it comes to yoledes, as any kind of shinui that you make, it's better to do a shinui than without a shinui. Others say, the Maggid Mishnah brings an opinion. The Maggid Mishnah suggests in the Rambam, like Rabbi Siegelman said before, the simple reading of the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam, is that when it comes to an ordinary Choleh sheyesh bo Sakanah, anything other than a yoledes, a woman giving birth is a special case, which we're stricter about. But any other case of Choleh sheyesh bo Sakanah, some poskim say we are more machmer, and we say that not more machmer, more mekel. We say that you don't use a shinui since the Sakanah is more clear. Maggid Mishnah says that even though a yoledes, we mentioned I think earlier, even though a yoledes is a slight question of Sakanah, it is very low, and even though we do treat it as Choleh sheyesh bo Sakanah, it's only 1 in 1,000, and therefore you use a shinui. But for a regular Choleh sheyesh bo Sakanah, you don't use a shinui. As I said, I think most posts can understand you do use a shinui, like the Ramah, but there is a shita that says that is a halacha that is unique to a yoledes, and for a regular Choleh sheyesh bo Sakanah, you don't use a shinui. But another point that comes up in the Gemara's discussion of yoledes, of a woman giving birth, the Gemara says we light a candle for her. If it's dark, we light a candle for her. So the Gemara says, obviously, why wouldn't you? If she needs a candle, she needs a candle. Why? What exactly is the novelty of that? So the Gemara says that the chiddush is the woman is blind. So you might think she doesn't benefit from the candle. No, the Gemara says she does benefit because her mind is set at ease. She says, if there's light, my attendants, the doulas, the midwives, the doctors, the nurses, if I need anything, they'll help me out. So she feels better about it. The post can explain, even though objectively there is no need for the candle, the attendants know that they can work in the dark. They know that whatever she needs, they can give her. They don't need light. But if she'll feel better, if the patient will feel better, then that itself is enough of a reason to light a candle. Chil Shabbos Daraisa, that itself is enough of a reason. So Tosfos explains, Tosfos makes this point explicitly, that the mind-body connection, if she becomes terrified, if she becomes agitated that she's not being treated properly, that itself can affect her physical condition, and that makes her a Choleh sheyesh bo Sakanah. This is not just doing everything we do during the week, not giving her something that she thinks she needs that will cause her to enter a state of agitation. That itself is considered Choleh sheyesh bo Sakanah, and that is a justification for Chil Shabbos. Rav Asher Weiss seems to be connecting this to the other Maggid Mishnah who says we do everything we do during the week because not giving her the full spectrum of medical treatment maybe can somehow worry her and can have an impact on her health, even though it's cancer that we're worried about. If we don't treat the scratch on her finger, somehow that'll exacerbate the cancer. Okay, I don't know, yes, no, but discussing briefly this last point, the Gemara says that psychological health of the Choleh sheyesh bo Sakanah is critical as well. We can light a candle, we can do Chil Shabbos Daraisa, for even though it's only for psychological reasons. The Gemara seems to say that we will do Chil Shabbos Daraisa for this. This is not, though, generally the halacha. There are other cases, there are other aspects of the halacha where we seem to reject this. There is a discussion in the Mordechai. The Mordechai discusses a case of someone who wanted to see his relative, and there was a concern he was going to get very agitated if he doesn't get to meet his relative. The Mordechai allowed it, but only because, but later poskim say it's because it's drabanan, that the poskim say that we allow it when it's drabanan. Poskim are not so willing to allow chil Shabbos daraisa for psychological reasons of the Choleh himself. And this is something that's debated in various concrete modern practical cases. One heavily discussed question is the husband accompanying his wife to the hospital when she goes into labor. So assuming the husband is not a doctor and is not actually going to provide medical treatment, he's just there for moral support, is there a justification for the husband being Mechal Shabbos, to travel on Shabbos to the hospital? For the wife, he can certainly go to the hospital for. She's a Choleh sheyesh Sakanah. But the husband, he's doing fine physically. Is there any heter for him to go for psychological reasons, like lighting the candle, the Gemara says? So Ramosha actually distinguishes between the two. Ramosha says that this is not like the case of the candle because the case Ramosha has a subtle distinction. He says the case of the candle, it's more natural for a person to worry. She's really expressing a rational concern. Today we take the attitude that all feelings are equally valid. Ramosha does not feel all feelings are equally valid. He says a woman who's terrified when it's dark, that's a very rational and reasonable fear. Even if objectively we think we can take care of her, she's right in being afraid, and therefore we can be Mechal Shabbos. This woman who decided, the wife, if my husband is not here, I'm going to be stressed, that's not so reasonable, he says. There's objectively nothing to worry about. She's just being nervous and unreasonable, he says. He says that maybe is not such an intense fear, not so legitimate affair, it's not so intense. And therefore he says, I'm not sure we would really be matir. Well, he says, maybe I'm splitting hairs. Who said we have the right to start making distinctions, he says. So if she really says she's really scared, he says, we can be makel for pikuach nefesh. We can allow, if she really says, without my husband, I'm really going to be distressed and agitated, we try to explain to her, he says, we should try to tell her that, we try to tell her there's nothing to worry about, but if it doesn't work, not surprisingly, it doesn't work, explain to her that she's fine, then the husband can go. Ramosha was ultimately willing to allow it, even though he wasn't 100% sure, but he was willing to allow it. The Nishmas Avram brings that some give another reason he can go, because he can help practically, can provide details of her medical history. He actually can be instrumental in her technical care. He says, okay, so some allowed it. Rabbi Yaakov Ariel was not very happy with the extensions of this heter. Yaakov Ariel, a leading posek in the Dati Lumi community in Israel, he quotes Rav Avram Yosef, one of Rav Avad Yosef's sons, that he says this heter of psychological well-being of the woman in childbirth. He says we can travel to a hospital that's farther away if she feels more comfortable there. If he quotes in the name of his father, Rav Avadia, she can travel to a more distant hospital if necessary to keep her calm. And said Rav Ariel, this idea of Yisuve Daita, of keeping her calm and happy, has gone way overboard, he says. We've gone beyond all reason, he says. First they were matir the husband, then they were matir the mother and the doula, he says, and then they have to take the kids to babysitters. He says this is going way too far. He says at the end of the day, it's true that it is important to preserve the equanimity of the Yoledis, he says, but not to go to preposterous lengths. He says at some point, Chil Shabbos is Chil Shabbos. You can't just say whatever she wants, whatever you have to do to make her happy, we do. He was unhappy with going quite that far. As I mentioned, another issue which Rabbi Yosef is quoted as talking about as well is the question of traveling to a more distant hospital. Again, if non-Jews are driving, it's much more lenient. In the U.S., it's often a non-Jew driving. But if you're doing Chol Shabbos Daraisa, you're driving to a hospital. The woman says, my doctor, my hospital, my birth plan is another 10 miles down the road. So is there a heter to go another 10 miles down the road? If the care is actually better, of course it's mutter. If she has a complex medical history and her hospital knows her history and will give her better care, of course it's mutter. But the question is, assuming it's a routine birth, any doctor, any OB can treat her. There's nothing particularly interesting about her history. Both hospitals are just as good. She happens to have a relationship or a rapport with one doctor. She wants to go to that doctor. Is there any heter to go to a further hospital in order to make her more comfortable? That's a major debate. Some poskim said yes, because that's all included in the heter of Yisuve Daita, of keeping her comfortable and keeping her mentally happy. Other poskim said no. Other poskim said that for Chilul Shabbos Daraisa, you can't do that. If it's objectively, medically not necessary, then there's no reason to allow Chilul Shabbos. There's no reason to allow that kind of Shabbos desecration just because she wants it. Again, we mentioned before the heter of the Maggid Mishnah. We do everything on Shabbos. We would do it during the week. At least it has to be actual medical care. Just to say she wants something, she wants to go here, she wants to go there. Not all poskim are willing to allow that. Some poskim say at the end of the day we have to apply some level of common sense. If there's no reason to believe that there's anything objectively better about the other option than to do a concrete question of increased Chilul Shabbos for that, not all poskim are convinced that is mutter. And particularly Rav Scheinberg, Rav Chaim Pinchas Scheinberg, is quoted as having been skeptical of this, as saying that he says, even though the Shmir Shabbos Kol Chassid and some others allow it, because one of the arguments is because of psychological well-being, he says it's not reasonable. It's not a reasonable concern. You can't just let a Choleh ask for whatever he wants and give it to him because of his psychological well-being. So this point is a major debate among the poskim. Okay, we'll hold it here. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Thank you all so much for listening, and I'm happy to sit here and take questions or discuss further if anyone has anything to say.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Rabbi?